The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias helps leaders to first recognize unconscious bias in ourselves and process it internally, and then to recognize bias in the workplace and offer strategies to cultivate diversity and inclusion. As humans, we all have unconscious biases. We take in 11 million pieces of information each second, but we can only consciously process about 40. To handle the gap, our brains create shortcuts. Most of our mental shortcuts, like our primitive brain's fight, flight, or freeze response, are necessary for survival. But sometimes our primitive brain's safeguards can override our thinking brain's ability to consciously process and act. In the book's performance model, individuals fall into one of three zones at any given moment. While most of us would never purposefully put someone else in the damaging zone, failing to recognize our biases can unintentionally put others in the limiting zone. As leaders, it is our responsibility to recognize the subtle cues that unconscious bias may be present, dig deeper to uncover the motivations behind them, and have the courage to create change. Like all self-improvement, this takes practice. But knowing change is necessary, even wanting to change is not the same as making change happen. So how do we as leaders turn something so innately human and flawed as bias into a tool to build better teams? Well, this model is the basis for the entire book. In it, the authors note that each step helps us make progress at different levels. I'll discuss in further detail how each step of the model directly relates to a section of our course study. We start with ourselves. A popular saying in the military is, check yourself before you wreck yourself. We can't lead others if we're not squared away ourselves. Two good ways to do this is through mindfulness and empathetic listening. To identify bias, we must first recognize it in ourselves. We must become mindful of our thoughts and actions and be willing to explore the origins of our biases. We can't reframe unconscious bias until we're willing to acknowledge it. Many leaders think they're good listeners when really they're just good at waiting for their turn to respond. Empathetic listening focuses on the intent to understand what others are saying and feeling, and the openness to be influenced by them. Next, we must try to cultivate connection with people, shifting ourselves and others into the high-performing zone. Finding our voice and setting the example models the way for those around us to create connections with each other. This starts with finding our voice. Exploring the origins of our biases leads to self-identification, and as we encourage others to find their voices too, that begins the conversation to affirming shared values, like those we explored in week 2. When leaders set the example by interacting with others through the lens of curiosity and empathy, they generate opportunities for all members of the team to develop a sense of belonging, which is essential for cultivating connection. Finally, we must choose courage, which comes in two types: bold courage and careful courage. Ethical leaders can use tricks like priming the brain and creating our own magic pause button to tap into these types of courage. Mark Twain said, "Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not the absence of fear." Many of our biases are rooted in fear. Brooke Detterline explained that to lead ethically, we must have the courage to act in the face of fear. With practice, we can retrain our brains to override our natural fear response and create muscle memory, so that when a real situation triggers that fear, we can use it as our cue for mindful action rather than avoidance. When we think of courage, we usually think of bold courage, the kind that demands immediate action. Remember that fight, flight, or freeze? Mental conditioning like priming the brain can help us access bold courage faster. As we learned in week 3, between stimulus and response, there is a space, the magic pause button. Through mental conditioning, we can lengthen that pause until we begin to habitually choose courage. This is careful courage. This is more appropriate in situations where we may be at risk personally or professionally and where safety is low. In these situations, the magic pause button gives us room to assess before we act. And that is a key trait of great leadership. We can all think of great leaders we'd like to emulate, But to get there, we have to lead ourselves in reframing bias, model the way to cultivate connection, and lead ethically to bring everyone on the team into the high-performing zone.